Hello and welcome to the program. I am Adeshawa Josh. Let's take you through major headlines around the world. And we will start in the United Kingdom, where the NATO summit kicked off today in Wales. And Western leaders have criticized Russia for destabilizing Ukraine. NATO and the United Kingdom have also warned that pressure on Russia would be increased if it did not change course in eastern Ukraine. Now, prior to that summit, Ukraine's president briefed US and EU leaders on earlier discussions on a ceasefire plan with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Some 2,600 people have died in fighting between Ukrainian troops and rebels. The summit is considered as the most crucial since the end of World War II.
Leaders took to a platform to pose for a group photo ahead of the official business at the NATO summit in Wales on Thursday, August the 4th. Among those posing for the picture were US President Barack Obama and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. President Obama and his 27 allies are meeting at a golf resort in Wales and are set to discuss how to tackle Islamic State straddling parts of Iraq and Syria, which has emerged as a new threat on the alliance's southern flank, and how to stabilize Afghanistan when NATO forces leave at year's end. NATO leaders have a lot to talk about this year, which is expected to be the toughest since the Cold War ended.
Our NATO summit here in Wales will be one of the most important summits in the history of our alliance. A crucial summit at a crucial time.
Even though what's at the top of their list is the crisis in Ukraine and the Islamic State militants, they paid tribute to the armed services of all international security assistance force nations who fought in Afghanistan.
We have done what we pledged to do. We have dealt a blow against international terrorism in Afghanistan, and we have built up capable Afghan forces of 350,000 troops and police. For over a year, these forces have been in the lead for security across the country. And by the end of this year, Afghan security will be fully in their hands. Our forces are
Rasmussen earlier accused Moscow outright of attacking Ukraine, and that statement stepped up Western rhetoric against Moscow.
Russian troops are illegally in Ukraine. The extremist Islamist threat has risen in a new form in Iraq and Syria. These are just two of the threats that we face. NATO is the anchor of our security, and over the next 2 days, we must reinvigorate and refocus this alliance to tackle new threats and to ensure it continues to foster stability around the world. This will be the last NATO summit before we end our combat mission in Afghanistan. And I believe we can be proud of what we achieved there.
No matter how deep the crisis might be, NATO has no plans to intervene militarily in Ukraine. It has focused on beefing up the defenses of former Soviet bloc Eastern European countries that joined the alliance in the last 15 years. Not everyone is in support of the summit. A coalition of protest groups, including the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, No to NATO, Stop the War, and South Wales Anti-Nuclear, gathered in Newport. The summit definitely has its supporters and its critics, but the latter will not bring the summit to a halt.
VOA Scott Stearns has been monitoring the summit, and he joins us now from the United States Department of State in Washington, D.C. Thanks a lot, Scott, for joining us on the program.
Sure thing.
Now, we do know that crushing the IS, that's the Islamic State militants, and supporting Ukraine is top on the agenda at the summit. What more do we know?
Well, you're right. The NATO attention will be divided between Ukraine and these push to build an international coalition against the Islamic State. On Ukraine, it's important to remember that Ukraine itself is not a member of the NATO alliance, so there is no legally binding obligation from NATO members to abide by the Article 5 section of NATO, which of course is that an attack on one is an attack on all. Ukraine is under attack, but because it's not a member of NATO, that is not seen as an attack on the NATO alliance itself. So NATO's role in confronting Russian aggression, as Anders Fogh Rasmussen said, is somewhat limited. In his meeting with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, Petro Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, said what's important about the Russian ceasefire proposal is closing the border between Ukraine and Russia. Of course, from the point of view of the government in Kiev, the idea there would be that that would prevent Russia from sending more troops across the border, and Ukrainians, according to President Poroshenko, could then sort that situation out themselves.
Well, that's right. But, you know, to what extent then do you think NATO is willing to go to defend its member countries? Well, you just said now that Ukraine is not part of that. NATO hasn't been faced with so much disorder since the end of World War II. As you have said, NATO isn't part of, Ukraine isn't part of the NATO countries. How do we move forward from here?
Well, I think the feeling is that the NATO members can certainly help Ukrainian authorities in a limited function, but you will not see NATO troops in Ukraine. President Barack Obama, on his way to the NATO summit, made an important visit to some of those former Soviet states that are members of NATO, reassuring leaders of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania that Russia will not be allowed to take the sort of action that it has taken in Ukraine, as those countries are NATO members. As you'll know, of course, Ukraine moving closer to NATO and moving closer to a relationship with Europe was one of the things that upset the Russians and led to this standoff with Ukraine. The feeling, I think, from the Obama administration's point of view is that this is broadly a European issue. And if European allies outside of NATO choose to intervene on the part of the Ukrainian government, then that will happen outside the alliance.
Now, well, forming a unified front, obviously, against IS is very crucial, because this is also another major point during the summit. Well, if they are to be defeated, there has to be a unified front. It will require the collaborations of local factions and groups like the Sunnis, who also see IS as a big threat. How do you see this play out as NATO begins to organize its strategy?
The coalition that the Obama administration wants to build to confront the Islamic State will certainly include many, if not all, members of NATO. But I think it's important to see this as happening outside of NATO. It is certainly something that leaders will be discussing at the NATO summit. There is a direct threat to European nations, given the number of nationals, passport holders of their country that are thought to be members of the Islamic State. That's a big worry, and something that President Obama is going to address directly with heads of states in the lead up to the United Nations General Assembly later this month in New York. But when it comes to building this coalition that Secretary Kerry will begin doing actively next week when he travels to the region, that will be far more focused on both helping the Kurdish Peshmerga forces that are already fighting the Islamic State in Iraq, helping stand up Sunni forces, Shia Iraqi forces that parts of the Iraqi army under the previous government, of course, fled in the face of the Islamic State advance. So what will be important is to help those fighters that will confront the Islamic State on the ground. This is not going to be a coalition like the world saw in the run-up to the first Gulf War or in